this point in the semester, it's usually pretty clear to me who in class is the type who says things like, plants are cool, plants are awesome, I want to know everything about plants. And who is the other type? When are we finally going to get into some animal related stuff? You know which type you are. And so, I thought I'd work in a reinforcement to the previous lesson on plant vascular physiology with the help of a few choice animal partners. In this case, insects in the order Hemiptera, also known as true bugs. For the appeasement of my animal-centric students, I'm interjecting this slight diversion away from our plant physiology focus to discuss a bit of entomology. Insects, after all, are the majority of animal species on Earth, and I'll rattle off a couple of famous quotes by famous biologists here. J.B.S. Haldane, remember him? One of the three responsible for the synthesis of Darwin and Mendel. Upon being asked about what he could infer about the Creator based on study of the natural order, he replied that one of the divine's characteristics would have to be an inordinate fondness for beetles. Another quote, attributed to Jarmila Kuklova Peck and also to Robert May, is, to a first approximation, all species are insects. If you ever decide to engage in further study in ecology, evolution, or entomology, you will surely be required to learn the major orders of the insecta. I'm not going to try to give you the full picture here. That would be impossible given insect diversity. Just a couple of the more important facts. Now, as you're tracing your way out on this enormously complex limb on the animal part of the tree of life, you first have to get past a few basally branching lineages, like silverfish, those annoying little things you find in your kitchen cabinets. Once you're out in the thick part of the insect tree, there are two main branches. One of them is characterized by complete metamorphosis, in which the egg hatches initially into a larva that looks totally different from the adult. Usually, the larva is effectively an eating machine that grows to size as quickly as possible and then pupates. During the pupal stage, its body changes dramatically, and it emerges from the pupal shell as an adult, or imago, that bears really no similarity at all to the larva. No one could guess that a caterpillar and a butterfly could be of the same species. Maggots and flies are another example of this. Grubs and beetles, another. Bees and wasps and ants, the insect order Hymenoptera, also have a larval stage that looks halfway between a grub and a maggot. All of these and a few other taxonomic orders of insects with complete metamorphosis are called holometabolists. Now, the other main set of insect orders has immature stages that look just about the same as the adult stages, oftentimes just smaller and lacking wings. In these insects, the early stages are not called larvae, but rather nymphs. An example that's familiar to most students is the grasshopper, which looks green and wingless in the nymphal stages, but mottled and winged as adults. Cockroaches, praying mantises, mayflies, stick insects are other examples. These orders of insects lacking complete metamorphosis are called hemimetabolists. One very successful hemimetabolous insect order is the true bugs, the order Hemiptera. These insects typically have shield-shaped carapaces, and they always have mouthparts adapted for piercing and sucking. We've already seen one member of this order when we talked about Chagas disease, caused by Trypanosoma cruzi, and its main vector was the kissing bug, the tritomine bug, that uses its piercing and sucking mouthparts to take blood meals from vertebrates. The majority of hemipterans, though, feed on plants. They insert their hypodermic syringe-like mouth into the vasculature of the plant and extract nutrients. It's not surprising that these insects are crop pests, and also not surprising that they're kind of hard to kill because Unlike an insect that chews and swallows plant material, the hemipterans don't really experience the pesticide residues that sit on the plant surfaces. We're going to survey 3 different hemipteran herbivores, and our first will be the cicada. People that have spent time in rural areas outside of California will probably be familiar with these bugs. They pop out of the ground in the summer, crawling up tree trunks as subadults, which is the last nymphal stage, and then undergoing a final shedding of the exoskeleton, but this time emerging as a winged reproductive adult. Most cicadas that I've encountered are large, black, and shiny, and they're known for all the noise they make. The chorus of thousands to millions of calling cicadas can be very, very loud. If you're stopped and quiet in a forest, they'll start calling louder and louder. But then if you yell, "Hey, quiet," or clap your hands, they'll shut down their calls. The calling is all about finding a mate, and once mated, the females will drill their eggs into the twigs of a tree. The twigs then die and fall off, and the nymph will then leave the dead twig and dig into the ground and start feeding on the xylem and phloem in the tree's root system. Xylem is mostly water, and the phloem in the roots is also rather low in sugars because other sugar sinks between the leaves and the roots would have already tapped much of the sugars out of the phloem before it reaches the roots. Moreover, the cicada larva needs to grow to a large size before emerging. It usually takes many years, up to several decades, for the nymphs of larger tropical species to reach a size where it can emerge and complete its life cycle. And that is all that you really need to know for the cicada's lesson to us on plant vascular physiology. It has to put on lots of weight, but it feeds on this thin liquid diet with little caloric content. No wonder it takes some of the large cicadas 20 years or more to mature. The side lesson here is thinking about how risky of a proposition this life cycle is. Let's say you are the progeny of a successful breeding season for cicadas. You go underground together with a large number of other tiny nymphs in the same year that you were born. If most of your cohort finishes growth and emerges in exactly 20 years, but you happen to come out in 21 years, is this going to be a good thing or a bad thing for your fitness? Well, you might at first think it's good because there's less competition. But all of your resource consumption took place during those 20 years of growth underground. By the time the adults come out, they're not competing for food. They're actually taking advantage of the presence of lots of other cicadas as potential mates. When you think about it, coming out a year too late is bad because of a couple of penalties that you suffer. First, there might not be so many mates to choose from. Remember that your year was particularly good, so coming out with the offspring from the parents of the year after you were born would presumably mean that you have fewer prospective mates than you would have had if you had come out with the majority of your cohort. Second, coming out a year after a big emergence could mean that you have a superabundance of cicada eaters, predators in your area to deal with. Raccoons and foxes and all different kinds of birds that got fat and reproduced like crazy the previous year when there's so many cicadas around. Those cicadas that came out on schedule would have had a normal density of predators feeding on them, and since the cicada prey were in such superabundance the year before you came out, they actually had a higher survival rate. After predators became satiated and stopped eating, the rest of the cicadas would be free to reproduce without much threat of predation. 1 year later, however, your year, there would still be all of the hungry predators from last year, as well as all of their babies. A normal or light emergence of cicadas in the year following a heavy emergence would experience really poor survival. This was the central idea in my professor Monty Lloyd's narrative for how the North American periodical cicadas east of the Rockies evolved to have synchronous emergence. The 17-year cicadas space their emergences every 17 years. For the 16 years in between, there are effectively no cicadas emerging. Lloyd argued that a very tight adherence to the schedule was maintained by selection against early or late emergers because they suffer predation at a higher rate relative to the cicadas emerging on the right ear. Moreover, the lack of cicadas during the many years between emergences was beneficial because of how it would not support high densities of local predators. Now, most people hear this and say, oh, yeah, I get it. Cicadas evolved so as not to give predators extra food for the 16 years before walloping them with too many cicadas to eat. The problem with this explanation, however, is that it doesn't work, at least not as an adaptation under the mechanism of Darwinian natural selection. It's unsupportable to suggest that the reason for long periods with no cicadas was to create a benefit for the cicadas that came out during a synchronous emergence. The problem here is the very same problem with any and all arguments based on something evolving for the good of the species, but lacking any direct benefit to the individual. The big advantage for emerging in the same year as everyone else in your cohort is that you don't get eaten when the predator-prey ratio is much higher, both the year before and the year after a peak emergence. If there's a benefit to you for contributing incrementally to the lack of food for predators the year before and the year after, this would be microscopic compared to the direct effect on your own survival of emerging on the right year. Note that I'm not saying that it isn't good for the population that fewer predators are around. I'm saying that if selection is going to favor synchronous emergence, it's going to be 99.9999% because of fitness effects on the cicadas and 0.0001% or less because of an advantage gained by giving the predators the previous year one more morsel of food. Anyways, where were we? Right. Cicadas grow slowly because of where on the plant they're feeding. By tapping into the root, there aren't high concentration of sugars, and there would definitely not be high pressures because the root is the final sink at the very end of the phloem. Sugar concentration and fluid pressure would both be low for the cicada nymphs, given where on the plant that they feed. Contrast this situation with that of aphids, another hemipteran insect that taps into the phloem in the leaves, right next to the source where the sugars are loading. Not only are the sugars abundant, the phloem sap there is under higher pressure. Basically, these insects are being pressure-fed a sugar-rich liquid food. Aphids are much smaller than cicadas, but they reproduce ridiculously fast, seeming to quadruple their biomass every couple of weeks. I'd be willing to bet that everyone who gardens not only knows about aphids, but also hates them with a fiery passion. Their explosive growth rate is not surprising given the energy content of their food. My question to you right now is, why is the aphid's food pressurized? Aphids' diets are so rich in energy content, their increase in biomass is usually limited by things other than calories. Just like the plants they feed on, nitrogen is often a limiting factor in aphid growth, and experienced gardeners will tell you that fertilizing your plants with heavy nitrogen will increase their attractiveness to aphids. Aphids often use their sugar wealth in establishing quid pro quo relationships with ants. Ants are notorious sugar junkies, and the aphids have the ability to make it rain, as they say, for the ants. The ants treat the aphids like the sugar daddies that they are. They protect the aphids from predators and even from the weather. Before an April shower, you can see ants carrying aphids into their burrows where they can stay nice and dry. And after the rain, you can see the ants carrying the aphids back onto their host plants. Again, it's easy to get distracted by the side story. The only lesson you care about here is the contrast between the food supply for the ant and the cicada, how they're different, and what this difference means in terms of their ability to grow quickly. The third hemipteran in our story here is the glassy-winged sharpshooter, which is a threat to agriculture everywhere it exists, either naturally or by introduction. In California, the sharpshooter is a relatively recent introduction, and our vineyards and table grape industries are the ones most affected. The sharpshooter is different from cicadas and aphids in being primarily xylem feeders. Xylem does carry some amount of carbohydrate, and in fact the cicadas also feed on the xylem, as well as the phloem, although it's still fundamentally correct for us to think of xylem as primarily a conduit for water and minerals. Now, the reason for great concern over the sharpshooter is not so much the damage that they cause directly by their feeding, but by the bacterial pathogen that they transmit from plant to plant through their feeding. Xylella fastidiosa is a gamma proteobacterium, the same group as... Okay, so this gamma proteobacterium takes up residence in the xylem vessels and causes blockage, not altogether different from the way that cholesterol-charged atheromas cause blockage in human coronary arteries. Now I want you to think about the effect that blockage in a plant's xylem vessels is going to have on the plant's physiology. The result of blocked xylem vessels is a condition called leaf scorch, where the parts of the leaves that are deprived of xylem water dry up and die. In grapes, it also goes by the name of Pierce's disease, and it's a condition that's practically impossible to eradicate because Xylella is present asymptomatically in many species of plants, and even in the plants that it does affect, the damage done ranges from mild to lethal. As long as there are sharpshooters around to transmit the Xylella from wild plants to grapevines, leaf scorch will continue to be a real threat. We're getting closer to the animals. Hang on, people. Just one more lecture.